And now I am thrilled to welcome Jim Rosenfield. Jim is an anchor for NBC 10 News in Philadelphia with more than 30 years in broadcast journalism. Prior to being an anchor for NBC 10, Jim worked at television stations in Washington, D.C., New York City, Chicago, and Houston. Jim is a 5-time Emmy Award winner, including for Best Anchor in our region. He has also been honored with the first Michael Judge Award for the New York Press Club for coverage of the aftermath of the 9/11 terror attacks. Jim is class of '81 from Duke, where he earned a Bachelor of Arts in English, and he is also a Duke parent. So welcome, Jim, and we will get started with our first question. How did you go from being an English major at Duke to broadcasting?
So first of all, one of the stops in the career that we didn't talk about was actually Durham, because that was my first station that I worked at. And it's kind of an example of how an obstacle can open a door. And I've seen that happen in my career several times. So I was an English major at Duke, as you mentioned. And I always had an interest in writing. My grandfather was a newspaper man. My father was in television, but on the sales side. So television was in our blood, in my family, but I had no set plan. This is what I want to do, and this is what I'm going after. But while I was at Duke, I transferred to Duke from Hamilton College in upstate New York, coming in as a junior. During that summer, before I arrived, Duke instituted core requirements. And so you had to have a certain number of, you had to have math, you had to have science. I was an English major. I thought I had left my math career behind in high school, where I got about as far as algebra. It was not my strong suit, but these core requirements that were instituted would apply to me as a junior and the freshman class coming in with me. I was a little shocked. I was a little annoyed. I took it all the way to the dean. I said, I only have 2 years to fulfill these requirements. The dean said, well, I'm sorry, but there's nothing I can do. If you want to take it up the chain of command, go ahead. And I went all the way to President Sanford at the time, Terry Sanford. He had me in his office. I made my case, and he said, I feel for you, but you're going to have to fulfill these requirements. And the reason I tell this story is because I only had 2 years to take all these core requirements. So I stayed for summer school that summer of my first year, of my junior year. But it wasn't quite enough. I took Intro to Computers. I don't want Mike Schoenfeld to dig out the my transcript, because I don't think I barely passed it. But because I was there for the summer, I thought, what else am I going to do to fill my time? I had met the general manager of then the CBS affiliate, WTVD in Durham, at a Chamber of Commerce luncheon. I was seated next to him, and he had given me his business card. This was before email, obviously. And I must have either written to him or called his office. He had said to me at that luncheon, if you ever want to visit the station, give me a call. And I followed through. It wasn't anything that was a vast major plan. He invites me to the station. He takes me into the newsroom. He introduces me to the news director, who happens to be a Philly guy, originally a Philadelphia Inquirer reporter and editor who had moved into television, and he was the news director at WTVD. And he was my sort of first mentor. And that led to an internship. And that is how I got my foot in the door into television. And once I was there, I was bitten by the bug. So had I not had to fulfill those core requirements, stay in Durham for that summer, figure out what else I was going to do, I don't know that I would be doing what I'm doing now, because it just, one thing led to another. They started to let me write for the newscasts. They started to let me go out with reporters. Then they started to let me do some reporting on weekends my senior year at Duke. And I also had a little stint doing the weather. So that's how it started. I think we have some archival photos from some of those times, but
yeah, we'll put those up. Oh, there you are, right in the middle. Look at that hair.
Look at that hair. Look at that anchor desk. It looks like a battleship.
Yeah,
that was WTVD in Durham.
That's great. Elisa, can you show the weather picture? There we go.
Yeah.
Same hair. Yeah. That's
and that's before the days of computers, and those are magnets that we put up on the map to give the temperatures, and the lake level was there too.
That's great. And
Complicated
so you started your career in Durham at
stuff.
WTBD. Can you just give us a brief overview of how you then made it to Philadelphia?
Sure. So after interning at TBD, Ned Warwick, my news director, in April before graduation, offered me a full-time job. He said, I can't pay you a lot, but he saw some potential in me. I actually had the opportunity to catch up with Ned some 40 years later, something like that, just a few weeks ago. He's back here in Philadelphia. And because he gave me that full-time offer, I stayed at WTBD and worked for 2 years, left WTBD, but stayed in the company and went to the ABC station in Houston. From Houston, I was there for 5 years, met my future wife there, who was a television producer there. And together we moved to Chicago to the ABC station, where I was the weekend anchor, worked for 9 years there. Then I went to New York, which is where I grew up, and worked at CBS and NBC at the local owned stations there. And then kind of had my first time where my next move was not my own. That had never happened to me before. In 2008, CBS, where I was the evening anchor, went through a recalibration of the entire budget for all the owned stations, and decided to lop off about 100 people from the payroll. And so I was on hiatus for 4 years to ride out my contract and figure out what was going to come next. And I actually had the wonderful opportunity to spend some time in Durham doing a fellowship attached to the public affairs department. Mike Schoenfeld was nice enough to invite me. We kind of created this fellowship as we went along. And because I was there, it's also why my son ended up at Duke, because he came to visit me, fell in love with the school, and decided he wanted to apply, and fortunately got it. Then from that period, I went to Washington, back to NBC, to the NBC station at the end of my CBS deal. I was there for a year, and that's when Philadelphia was kind of restructuring the NBC station, and they were looking for a main anchor. And the bosses here asked my boss in Washington if they could talk to me, and the rest is history. I came here over 7 years ago to anchor.
That's great.
The,
And I think
the
it's
evening
very,
newscast.
I think it's very cool you did time at Duke, and maybe tell everybody what I thought was the coolest part about your time at Duke, which I still cannot get over.
So you were fascinated by the fact that I lived
was.
on Central Campus in an apartment that's not there anymore. I think they've been torn down, right?
They have been torn down, and they should have been
Yeah.
torn down when you were living in them too. So can you tell us just a little bit about what your typical day is like and how decisions are made about what to include in a news broadcast?
Sure. So because I anchor the evening and late newscast, so I anchor the 5 p.m. hour, 6 p.m. half hour. We have a half hour at 7 p.m., which we added during the first impeachment trial of Donald Trump. And then we have a half hour at 11 p.m. So I work a 2 to sort of midnight shift, if you will. So I'm that part of the day. So before I get to work, there's a 9 a.m. editorial meeting, which I am not on, but the Dayside team is on. So that includes all of management, the news director, the assistant news director, the managing editor, the executive producers of the afternoon newscasts, reporters call in. We're doing all this now virtually, obviously. And we kind of go over what are the stories of the day that we know we have to cover. Reporters also pitch their ideas. And together, it's kind of this soup that they make. And there are decisions made in the morning that then we revisit at 2 p.m. on an editorial call that I join with the other anchors in the afternoon newscasts and evening newscasts. And we kind of do a recheck. What's working, what's not working, what's happened since the morning that we need to add. It's a very collaborative process. Everybody gets to share their views, speak their mind, talk about why is this a lead or why isn't this story that's not the lead story. And it's a give and take. and we moved pieces of the puzzle around. And that continues right up and during news time. Things can obviously happen and we move things around.
That's very cool. So I thought we'd move on to now what it's been like covering the COVID-19 pandemic. So one of the things I think is really interesting is just the logistics of a news organization once the pandemic hit. How did you deal with the logistics?
I'll never forget the evening, my news director came to my desk and my co-anchor Jacqueline London's desk, and he said, your days of coming to the 12th floor are over. And we kind of didn't understand what he was saying. And this was in March a year ago. We knew that the pandemic was upon us, but we didn't know what the plan was and how it would impact the broadcast. We are in the Comcast Technology Center. We have 3 floors in that brand new tower. And the newsroom is on 12, the studios are on 13, and then there are offices up on 14. So what he was saying was, you are not going to enter the newsroom anymore. You're going to come in on the studio level. I want you separated from everybody in the newsroom because we need to keep pods safe. And so the next day began this whole new world, and it really changed the whole way we did our broadcasting. We kind of created a remote station, if you will, where 3/4 of the team was at home and a skeleton crew, which included me, was at the station. And half the anchor teams had work from home setups created. They had to, as you can imagine, invest in a lot of equipment to get everybody ready to anchor from home. And that also included everybody else was sent home. Our sales team worked from home, still does. HR works from home. Engineering partially from home. Directors, some of them were directing newscasts from home.
Wow.
With a screen up on their computers that showed them all the monitors in the control room. So we really created, producers were producing from home, writers were writing from home. And we created a virtual newsroom on Teams, Microsoft Teams, and that was up all day, still is, we're still using it, whereby anybody who has something that's important that they have to say, they just, turn on their mic, and it's as if we're in the newsroom, because in a normal newsroom, it's a lot of back and forth, people shouting, people talking, and that was gone. And so my co-anchor worked from home for about 8 months, I think it was. Some of us are now back in the station together, but and we have some pictures to show you what it used to be like, where we were all together on this anchor desk, and suddenly we had to be separated. And on the right there we are together on the anchor desk. This is before COVID.
Close
certainly
together,
not 6
right?
feet apart.
Right.
And this is where I anchor the newscasts for now, safely from the newsroom. And there's a handful of people in that newsroom. And that desk is usually used for breaking news or for reporters who have a story that, they don't need to be out in the field for. But that's where I've been anchoring for the better part of the period during which my co-anchor was working from home. I was in the studio. But since she's come back into the studio, I now anchor from there. And we're hoping for a day soon where we can be back together on the desk. But you can imagine it created this need to re-envision how we would bring our newscasts to the public and keep broadcasting, but do it safely. It was a challenge.
Yeah, that I can't even imagine. Now, sort of second, can you talk about reporting on the pandemic itself? As the story was constantly evolving, as the scientists learned more about the disease, what was that like?
That for anybody watching, how the information was sort of just coming at us, and you had to sort through what's important, what does the public really need to know today, because it was a changing environment every single day. In the initial days, we had a whiteboard in the newsroom where we were writing down, we're a tri-state coverage area. We cover South Jersey, Pennsylvania, the Philly suburbs, and Delaware. And we had a whiteboard where we were starting to write down the number of cases in each of our 3 states. And it started with, single digits. And when it got to the point it was triple digits and then thousands, we abandoned that whiteboard. It was a reference point in the newsroom, but then we started to translate that to, the larger numbers that were exploding and brought those to our viewers in graphics. It really changed the dynamic of our newscast because there was so much public health information that we felt a responsibility to share with our viewers and impart to them. And it continues to this day. What's the latest on vaccine distribution? In the early days, what's the case count? Where are they? We started with counties, and each county and each municipality and each state would hold daily briefings, which we would, in the early days, we would join live no matter what time of day it was. And we would use their information to share that with the public because it was really important information. And we also we built a team of medical experts, public health experts that we relied on for advice and expertise. What does this mean? And we still do that to this day. And we did more sort of Q&A kinds of interviews with those experts. And we allowed them to breathe a little bit longer than you would normally see in a newscast because it was important information, and also took some of the burden off of our writers who were working from home and working off laptops, and their job function was made quite a bit more difficult, churning out the content and the volume of content. So by allowing those news conferences to breathe a little bit, or talking to our experts in a Q&A setting, it also, to be honest, filled up some time in those early days, especially when we were kind of all shell-shocked. How are we getting these newscasts on the air?
Well, I can imagine that, this has been a story that's been going on, for over a year now, that keeping the news sort of fresh in that regard must be difficult.
It is, and but we kind of feel the key information is far more important than anything to do with whether it seems repetitive. If we are learning something that's really key in the fight to get people vaccinated, and it's repeated in several newscasts, that's okay, because we want our viewers to get that information. And we want them to know that the Black Doctors COVID-19 Consortium is doing a 24-hour vaxathon. And this is where you can go to get a vaccine if you're from these zip codes. And so there is some repetition, but we are also constantly updating. We're also talking about in our meetings about how do we keep this interesting and keep this fresh? Is there a different angle on this? Who is this impacting? And so some days you'll see we focus on businesses. Some days we focus on seniors. Many days we're focusing on schools and kids learning from home and the challenges that brought. And yes, we've done those stories many times over in the last year, but we've also seen it evolving, and we're kind of just in this past week, we're turning that corner. We feel it. We're getting to do some more positive stories, which is a good feeling. It's been tough. There have been some days where we all just look at each other, as everybody at home does. Is this ever going to end? We wonder.
Yeah, I can't imagine. So I thought we'd move now to covering the racial protests that from 2020. First, can you tell us about covering the peaceful protest march on the Vine Street Expressway in June? Because that was that story went national, and that was cool.
Sure. And with a pandemic, right? So you had that overlay, if you will, of suddenly there was a crisis out on the streets that we had to cover in the midst of a pandemic that involved crowds. So you can imagine the challenge for our staff to report on that, our camera crews and our reporters. But we were on the air live, excuse me, when the protesters moved to the Vine Street Expressway. I think we were in our 5 o'clock newscasts, and they had started to move, and our reporters were kind of advised, if crowds start to move, it's best if you don't move with them. We had many, we can talk about this later, but we had advice from security experts about the best way to be safe and cover this. But as it was unfolding live, and I'm looking at a monitor in front of me that, is not a 50-inch screen, it's a smaller monitor, and I'm trying to see, I see some smoke kind of coming up from the expressway. I see people climbing up that embankment. My assistant news director was watching it to my side, and she said, that is no small hill they're climbing. And it was all unfolding live right before us. And initially we weren't sure what that substance was that had been used on the crowd. We now know, it was tear gas, and there were other means used by police which have come under heavy criticism. But it unfolded live before our eyes, and we had to sort of share with the viewer what we were seeing and witnessing in the moment. So, all of the scripted, if you will, written newscast out the window in those times. It's completely turned into a live ad lib kind of experience. And it becomes a conversation really between myself, my co-anchor, reporters in the field, the crew in the chopper sometimes will be able to chime in. And thankfully, we have a helicopter which gave us that bird's eye view of what was going on.
Yeah, and the fact that it, did cause national outrage, and it really got picked up so broadly, how did that impact your sort of the ongoing reporting there? Because you went from sort of being something that was regional to something that really had national import.
Our investigative team, we have an investigative unit, and they've focused quite a bit of their time on the aftermath of those days. And it involved asking questions of, our mayor and our police commissioner. And our police commissioner, Danielle Outlaw, was new on the job, several months in, but new on the job when those protests happened. So our investigative team spent many months digging into, videos from people who were there. And then an independent report was issued, and our investigative team was able to get body cam footage from police officers who were, in that case, right around City Hall. But you got sort of that point of view experience of what they were up against. They said, we're outmanned, we should have the National Guard here. And we continue, because it's still been a learning experience for the police department. The police commissioner admits, there's still a lot that they're taking away from that. And the investigation isn't quite over within the police department, as I understand it. But it was clear, and the commissioner admits this, that they were unprepared. And outside experts who were involved in our reporting said, they should have realized, given what we had seen in other parts of the country, that was potentially an explosive situation. And they just did not have the manpower. And the police commissioner, when she found out what the manpower allotted for that day was, I believe she found out that morning, she realized it was going to be inadequate. But by then it was too late. Think about having to call in people who are off duty, try to get them up and running in a timely manner. It just didn't happen. So it's a story that we've covered quite a bit since that day. And not only the Vine Street Expressway, but the looting that was earlier in the summer, but also during the pandemic. That was devastating to see here in Philadelphia, in Center City and outside the Center City area. I field anchored from Walnut Street the day after the looting, which I think was on a Sunday. I did the newscast from a deserted Walnut Street. It looked like a war zone. almost every storefront was either boarded up or shattered glass everywhere, alarms still going off. There had been a fire on the block that was damaging to a couple of buildings. It was a very sad scene to see.
So can you tell us a little bit about, you mentioned it briefly, and I thought maybe we could come back to it, how reporters cover these mass protests safely, both just generally and then also during COVID, right? I mean, it's sort of a double-edged sword there.
Mm-hmm. You know, everybody's sort of given the opportunity to say, I don't feel comfortable, or you know, I don't feel comfortable for COVID reasons, or I don't feel comfortable for safety reasons. So those discussions happen with management. But, you know, our crews have been very brave, I have to say, and they did cover the unrest. And some of our reporters and camera people were right there the night of the mass looting in Center City. I was not working, it was on a weekend, but I worked the following day, as I mentioned. But we have discussions about best practices. Don't draw attention to yourself. Our news director at the time, who has moved on within the company to become head of diversity and inclusion, I mean, he really helped guide our team and made it clear that, you know, don't put yourself at risk. If at any time you feel you're not safe, you remove yourself from that situation. We also had briefings from the NBC security teams, and they advised us best practices, what to look for, situational awareness, particular elements in the crowd that might tip you off to who is part of that crowd. And also security was provided. Depending on the day, it was a case-by-case basis, but we went out with security on many instances. So it was a delicate situation. It wasn't comfortable, but we felt it was important, obviously, to be out there and to be able to let people know how people were feeling and what they were protesting and why.
Yeah, I think that the news coverage of that across the board was just excellent. I thought. So I thought maybe we could spend a little bit of time, because I know this is probably going to generate a lot of questions too, covering the election. Can you maybe start by talking about the difficulties around reporting on the election when there appeared to be so many false stories and so much misinformation out there? How do you how do you make sure you're sharing the truth with the audience without looking like, you're taking sides?
Well, fact checking became a much more frequent practice because we often had to fact check in real time. Real-time fact checking is something we are used to doing, for instance, during a political debate or immediately afterwards. Did candidate A, was that accurate when they said X, Y, or Z? Well, it turns out maybe partially. But during the election, we found that became a much more full-time kind of gig when it came to fact checking what some of the candidates were saying. And also think about it, the flow of information has changed so much. We went from back in the day when I started at WTVD in Durham, it was a 3-network operation, ABC, CBS, NBC. Then we went to 24/7 cable. And then you layer in the Twitter sphere and social media. And we've just become not only 24/7, but, by the second, information is churning out. And people are consuming that information. And as we know, you can take that information in, and some people will take it upon themselves to do a little fact checking of their own, or they'll dive in and do some research and figure out what the truth is. But we felt it was our responsibility at times to, fact check the President of the United States. And we would have conversations in the newsroom about a tweet that he had put out. Are we going to air this tweet? If we air this tweet, are we going to immediately point out the other side or the truth of the matter? because let's face it, there were times when the president of the United States was putting forth a narrative that the election, was stolen from him, obviously, before, during, and after Election Day, because the buildup, as we saw, started before Election Day, setting the table, if you will, for if he were to lose. So we had many, many discussions about how to do that fairly, accurately for our political reporters, especially Lauren Make, who is an excellent, thorough political reporter on our team. She was out there and she was attending rallies, few and far between in this election cycle, but there were some. And she was talking to voters. And I talked to Lauren the other day about this. And, there's a difference between immediately fact checking maybe a man on the street or a voter soundbite where they express their opinion about how candidate A is performing, or how a president's policies are impacting them, or whether you believe the pandemic is real, or whether you believe face masks are important. And in the moment, it's not necessarily the case where you feel you have to fact check them or you have to challenge them, because you kind of want to take the temperature of the voters, right?
Right.
You want to see what's out there. What are people feeling? What are people saying? And it's a different set of circumstances when you are interviewing or hearing from an elected official, public official, where we, especially if we have the opportunity, will challenge a fact that they are putting out as fact that may not be the case. So in those instances, we do try very hard to, and Lauren Make, if you watch our product, does a really good job of challenging and questioning again if she doesn't get the answer. And she did that with, all the way up the chain. She did it with the Vice President of the United States. So we also relied on our network colleagues as much as we could, because we really are a global operation. We're an NBC-owned television station. So we have the resources of NBC News, and we do collaborate, we do share, and we have experts at the network level who covered the candidates. So we would, and Kristen Welker is an ex-NBC tenor, she's a Philly gal. So we, as much as possible, we would do talkbacks with them and get their take on what we were seeing or hearing, so that we aren't just covering it locally.
Yeah, I can't even imagine. I mean, the idea that you have to decide, can we even say what the president tweeted, because are we somehow, if we know it's not right, are we somehow, propagating the falsehood? So I can imagine that the conversations that must have happened in the newsroom, on the one hand, you need to do it, and then you have to fact check. And I can't imagine how that was. But we knew for a long time, probably for 4 years, that Pennsylvania was going to be an incredibly key state in the election. Philadelphia in particular played a big role in the election, from the ballot counting at the convention center to the Rudy Giuliani's press conference at the Four Seasons Landscaping.
Yeah.
Can you give us some color around that? I think everybody would love to hear about, sort of as the election was happening and Pennsylvania and Philadelphia were so important.
So obviously we had those conversations in the newsroom early on. Pennsylvania is a battleground state. It's going to be important. We knew that. And then we saw the barrage of television ads on our air. They were constant. Our break times within our newscasts were suddenly filled with like 3 minutes of ads, which in a 30-minute newscast, if each break is 3 minutes, think about that. That's taking up a whole lot of time for these candidates to get their message across when we're trying to present the news. But obviously we run it, and it's important to carry them. And that was sort of the beginning of what we started to see. And then we also saw visits from the candidates throughout the cycle, and that included right up on Election Day. Joe Biden was on our air in a one-on-one from the Constitution Center on Election Day while the polls were still open. So that tells you how important it was to them. They felt they had a message they still had to get out on Election Day in this key battleground state. As for, some of the color, I mean, the convention center and the ballot counting, that became, a deep dive into minutia that we don't normally cover. How many mail-in ballots have been counted today? How many military ballots, absentee ballots? And we were doing counts that we don't normally get into. It's kind of like back to the hanging Chad days where you're finding out about elections in a way you never knew before. And the day of the Four Seasons news conference, it was over a weekend. I wasn't working, so I was kind of watching it from afar, just as everybody else was. But I was getting emails on my work email from the Four Seasons Hotel, because the Four Seasons Hotel is a brand new hotel at the top of our building and the Comcast Technology Center. It's the top 12 stories. And it's a beautiful, brand spanking new luxury hotel. And they're putting out statements saying, we are not hosting this news conference by Team Trump. It is not at this location. And of course, we all now know where the location was. It was just a bizarre turn of events that they had to put out a statement saying that, no, the Four Seasons Hotel is not holding this news conference. International press as well, during the count at the convention center, not necessarily socially distanced. A lot of people kind of crowding in together. There was that going on.
And the allegations that the poll watchers weren't allowed to be there. I have to say, I learned more about all that watching what was going on in the convention center. Yes,
and we came to find out the poll watchers were there, it was fascinating to watch that process, which we had taken for granted, really, in the past.
Yeah, it was very interesting. It was obviously very exciting when Pennsylvania was the state that pushed Biden over the 270 electoral votes. And when the state was finally called for Biden on that Saturday after Election Day, can you tell us sort of about the reporting and sort of what went along with that?
Sure. So I'm sitting at home and my wife and I are here, and we at a certain point hear horns blaring and people are out in the streets shouting, and we knew what had happened. Obviously we had the television on. So we went out there, and I took my work phone with me, and I'm texting my bosses and the assistant news director, who was acting news director at the time, because as I said, our original boss had moved up in the company. She said, yes, we want you to field anchor. Go to Independence Mall and you'll anchor from there at 6 o'clock. And this was on a Saturday, right? So there were people everywhere. In the pandemic, you've got your mask on and you kind of are thinking, how am I going to do this safely? In the midst of this crowd. So I was kind of with my wife walking in the middle of the street, away from the crowds. And then the crowd seemed to move to City Hall. And I think we have a little clip of video to show you, to kind of give you the atmosphere. It was a party. It was a party at City Hall. And if you want to take a look, you'll hear what it was like. So I took that with my cell phone and then anchored, but I kind of tried to separate myself from the crowd and kind of got up on a wall with my photographer away a little bit from that sea of people. And we did the whole newscast from that location. Rosemary Connors, the weekend anchor, was co-anchoring with me from the studio. And I was out there to sort of give the color of the moment. And we also were mindful that there's a part of the population that was not partying, that was not celebrating, and we included that part of it as well.
Yeah, and then I think the obviously what happened on January 6th, while not here in Philly, was something that impacted people, and I know you personally. And you want to tell us a little bit about the news, the little statement you made at the newscast?
Sure. So we were on the 2:00 editorial call, and people in the newsroom, a lot of us were, not in the newsroom. So we're kind of seeing things coming across our phones and on the TV. But during that 2:00 call is when people started saying this is serious going on at the Capitol. This is big. And the network took over. If you recall, it was, obviously hours and hours of the network covering it. So we kind of stepped back, and we were observers too for much of that afternoon. And we did finally get on the air once around the time that the network gave us an opportunity to do some of our local newscasts, and around the time that it became clear that the Capitol was safe. But my boss came to me and said, I think in an unusual request, which we don't normally do, she said, I think we need to hear from you. I think the viewers would appreciate hearing from you to help us sort of feel okay about what's going on. And I said, okay. And that was kind of it. She just left it in my hands. So I had to sort of ruminate on that for a couple of hours, and I took a few notes down before I went into work. And then once I got in and I spoke to the producer of the newscast, and I said, I need some pieces of video. Here's the order. And I wrote this piece, and it was, obviously a delicate situation. And I sent it to my boss. I said, what do you think? And we did have a discussion about whether we would include the word lie in terms of what President Trump was saying about the outcome of the election. And that was the one line where my assistant news director kind of did a little wordsmithing for me. Collaborative process. I love that, actually. I love when we can talk back and forth about how do we want to say something. And at 6:30, going into nightly news, at the end of the newscast, we aired this statement, which I had never done before.
Wanted to take a minute, take a deep breath together right here, right now, before we send you to nightly news, because this past 24 hours, there's been a lot to take in, right? We were so ready to put 2020 in the rearview mirror, but a mere 6 days into the new year, these images flooded our televisions, our social media, shared with friends, shocked at this boiling point, or maybe not shocked. A breach of a sacred building seen across America and across the globe. These are fellow Americans, Americans who believe something was stolen from them. They believe it because our president has been selling it to them as the truth. And now, after all this time, members of the president's own party are finally helping us figure out how to deal with sentiments like this.
I think that this election was rigged, stolen, it was fraud.
The best way we can show respect for the voters who are upset is by telling them the truth.
So can we pick up the pieces and move forward? Seems like that's something captured so poignantly in this photo from the AP shared on Twitter. That's New Jersey Congressman Andy Kim picking up debris on the floor of the Capitol. We've moved forward as a country after worse than this. Let's hope we can do so now. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect point to sort of transition over to the Q&A now. I know we have some Q&A in the chat, and I will throw it to my colleague Elisa
Sure.
Oliver and ask her to give you some questions.
Yeah, the first question I'm going to have us do is actually, I'm going to have somebody come off mute because the question was very personal to them and their context. So Priscilla, if you are around, I'd love to ask you to come off mute, and I'll ping you once I see you.
Great. Thank you. I should be off mute if you can hear me.
Yes.
Yep.
Fantastic. Jim, thank you so much for your time. This was incredibly informative. I am Duke class of 2005. I've been in Philadelphia for about 3.5 years now. And so my question is about audience connection in terms of reporting the news. So I'm a general pediatrician at CHOP. I'm also a health policy consultant for the health department. As a resident, I'm a Black woman in the city of Philadelphia. So when I listen to the news, I'm wanting to hear updates on medical information, but I also want to hear on community-specific resources that are for people like me. So when you're reporting, how do you ensure that the news is connecting with different audiences, especially as news is critical as the COVID-19 pandemic? Of course, I'm asking from my lens, you know, as a Black person, as a Black woman, but this could also be elderly communities, other communities of color, women, men, et cetera. Just how are you making sure in such a short amount of time that the information can hit so many different demographics and communities?
I love that question, Priscilla. So first of all, short amount of time, not really, because if you think about it, we go on the air in the afternoon anyway at 4 p.m. We do a full hour. We do a full hour at 5 p.m. We do another half hour right after that at 6 to 6:30. Then we have another half hour, 7 to 7:30, 11 to 11:30. And then we have our morning newscast, 4 to 7 a.m. So that's a lot of airtime. And then we have 11 to 11:45 a.m. That's a lot of day part to fill with information. And to your point, we have daily discussions about just what you're talking about. Are we inclusive? Are we remembering this particular part of the community? How do we get those voices into the newscast? We have a diverse staff ourselves who are very much in tune with, plugged into elements of the community. And our management is very mindful of making sure that we're broad-based in terms of the constituency that we kind of serve. And so we're constantly trying to do better, do more, to hear those voices, to include them. And it's a very big part of what we talk about every day. And if we didn't hit it on Monday, we're going to try and hit it on Tuesday. Do you know what I mean? We're going to try and find that element. If we didn't manage to do it one day, we're going to try and do it another day. Or we told the story from this perspective, but maybe we should touch on this perspective the next time we do it. And it's kind of goes without saying that every story we tackle, we want to be inclusive of many different voices and many different parts of our viewing area as much as we can. Yeah, there are challenges, there are logistical challenges, there are the challenges of who's available, when. But I have to say, one of the things I didn't talk about earlier was in this changing kind of pandemic kind of reporting, one of the things that has made it a little easier logistically is we can now connect with people via Zoom or via Skype or FaceTime, and we don't have to drive an hour to get them. We go right into their office or their home virtually, and it does make it easier in many ways to include more voices. And suddenly the viewer doesn't really care anymore that the broadcast quality, just as you saw in that clip of me, which was a little herky-jerky because of, you know, the bandwidth, whatever that video was recorded on. You know, the viewer is forgiving because the information is more important than necessarily a broadcast quality image. That's changed a lot. So it's something we talk about and think about and try to do every single day. But I love the question.
Thank you, Priscilla, so much for raising that. And she raised another question that was kind of echoed by Dave. Both of them have a question about how news has evolved over time. Dave said, Jim, you mentioned how news sources change from when you started in Durham to now. He specifically wanted to know about how verifiable sources have changed. And similarly, Priscilla was wondering how social media has changed reporting with information traveling faster and almost no time to fact check before distribution.
So it is fast paced. There's no doubt about it. And on the one hand, parts of it make it easier, parts of it make it more difficult. You know, as far as reliable sources and information, the internet certainly makes it easier for us to do some deep diving into what it is we're being told or what it is we're hearing or who this person is. And our digital team does a fantastic job of kind of checking for us to find out, you know, if we're getting a story via Facebook, you know, people can reach us through, you know, a Facebook message. Our digital team will be able to kind of vet that person for us. And likewise, if there's a perpetrator of a crime, you know, social media has made it far easier to, you know, learn more about that person. But we do a very careful job of making sure we don't go on the air or we don't put it on our website if we haven't done our homework. And we haven't checked to make sure this is the same person. You know, is this a reliable person who's telling us this information? And obviously we have the age-old checks and balances of, you know, we don't go with one source. That's still very old-fashioned. That hasn't changed. You know, you need double, triple sourcing, especially depending on what the information is that's being given. And that part of it has not changed. But yes, there's a lot of stuff coming over the transom and now via social media. And we like to be first, but we also want to be accurate. So gone are the days where you're going to rush something on the air. We really never wanted to do that, but it's much more important, obviously, that we make sure that what's in a tweet or what's posted on Facebook or what's in an Instagram story is legit, is real. And we do our very best to make sure before anything hits air. So we get a lot of information that you guys at home don't even see, obviously, because it doesn't meet the bar. It doesn't, it doesn't, we aren't comfortable with sharing it with our viewers because it's not safe enough.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think we've got time for one more question. And this one's a little more about you personally than about news reporting in general. Dave asked, he's curious if you've ever considered doing more opinion-based anchoring, like MSNBC, for instance, or have you always wanted to pursue straight reporting? Do you think any news professional can train for either type, or are people generally better suited for one or the other?
That's a great question. And I've always, so one of the frustrations when we're out in public is the blurring of those lines between what is opinion-based programming and what is actually news reporting. And we know that the cable networks devote portions of their day to the opinion side of things. And then there's a portion of the day or certain day parts or shows that are fact-based. And I've always been much more comfortable with the straight reporting. You know, and it's also one of the reasons I sort of didn't go to the network side of things was because when I was younger, what I really loved was connecting with a local community. And I've always felt that way. And not living out of a suitcase and running from city to city in a matter of hours sometimes, as the network correspondents do. They do such a great job. But I knew in my heart that that was not the life I wanted to lead. I loved being, you know, home, connected to a community, able to raise my boys with my wife and know that at the end of the day, I was going to be at home in the, you know, in my community. And the other part of the answer to your question about, is it something I would ever want to do, be on the opinion-based side? It's not for me. And you know, you'll notice that many of those people have sort of large personalities, and yeah, I'm more reserved, and it's not something I want to put out there. And it's not why I got into journalism, really. I love the digging for the truth part of journalism. And I love being able to report and write, and not just the anchor side. I really love diving into an important story and doing a longer form deep dive into some of those stories, which I've been fortunate enough to get some recognition for. And that makes it all worthwhile for me. You know, I did in the last year or so, I did a story on children of priests, and I was fortunate to have a woman share her very personal story with me about having a son whose father was a priest after a 15-year affair, and how the church, in her eyes, wanted her to hide that fact, and how she fought against that. And I was delighted that it was recognized with an Emmy. So those are the kinds of things I enjoy doing, more than necessarily spouting off my personal opinion about situation A or B. There's a place for it, it's just not for me.
Thank you so much for sharing so honestly, and I'll let Louise close us out.
Yes, thank you so much, Jim. This has been a fascinating conversation. I mean, first of all, a whole look back at this year, which I know is what we advertised, but it really has been an amazing time to listen to it from your perspective. And I know you're a very busy man, so we really appreciate your taking the time to do this today. Sue, it was wonderful. Your moderating was fantastic to have the two of you in conversation together. And I want to thank Elisa so much for her handling of the Q&A. We will be following up with everyone who registered for the program with links and more information. Jim has graciously agreed for us to post the recording on the Demon Lounge, so that our students at Duke who are studying, that's part of the Duke Arts Media and Entertainment Arts Media Network. So it'll be there for them to hear and for anyone else to have access to.
And Louise, if anybody wants to connect, I just want to say, Duke students, you know, I'm on Twitter and Instagram. It's at Jim Rosenfield, all one word. Follow me there, and you know, we can talk.
Yes,
also on Facebook at Jim Rosenfield News, all one word.
We will put that in our follow-up information as well. And so would love for people to connect with you, continue to follow you on all of your social platforms, as well as please follow Duke University and Duke Alumni and Duke Philadelphia. Thank you so much, everyone who's attended today. Hope you have a rest of a great afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you at another Duke Philly event soon. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim.